Among the dead bodies found near Fere village were witness P718's 3 cousins, who Abdulrahman had refused to release near the police station days earlier. To the east of Delej, a survivor identified an execution site near Andi. To the south of Delej, survivors identified execution sites in the direction of the mountains in Arawala, near Koska Mountain, and between Koska and Ordu. Also to the south, witness P714 found about 20 dead bodies in an area near Koska Mountain. Most appeared to have bullet wounds in the backs of their heads, and their clothing was soaked with blood. Also to the south of Delej, witness 651 found more than 40 dead bodies. The bodies were lying face down, with their hands tied behind their backs. They appeared to have been shot to the back or side of the head, and there were large pools of blood amongst them. Witness P671, who, as I described yesterday, saw his father and brother arrested by Abdulrahman in a camp days earlier, helped to bury bodies in an area to the south of Delej. At paragraphs 52 to 54 of his statement, he describes this, quote, "I saw the adult male bodies of 20 to 40 prisoners who were executed. I noticed they were all lined up next to each other, all suffering gunshot wounds, mostly in their backs and heads. The majority were lying face down, while some were twisted on their sides and backs. There was a strong smell in the area. Some of the bodies that I viewed had their hands tied behind their backs, wearing civilian clothes, with a large amount of dried blood around them. Some bodies had their hands untied. I presumed they were some of the prisoners I saw lying face down near the Delej police station days earlier. Among the bodies, I managed to find my father and brother, who were lying apart from each other. Although both had swollen faces, I was sure it was them. The villagers and I started digging to bury the bodies near the areas where they were found. I buried my father and brother myself in a separate grave." End of quote. Mr. President, Your Honours, although the main search and arrest operation took place on or about Friday, 5 March 2004, the Janjaweed and government forces continued to arrest people in Delej for at least 2 more days. The killings also continued. On or about Sunday, 7 March 2004, another group of detainees was taken to an area outside of Delej and killed. There were at least 5 detainees in this group, including 4 leaders of the Fur community. And their names, now seen on your screen, were Omda Adam Kindiri, also known as Adam Dagis of Forgo, Omda Jiddo Kamis of Gaba, Omda Muhammad Suleiman Abdul Shafa, also known as Durbo of Tanako, Sheikh Ismail Abdulaziz, also known as Dikobi of Garsila, and Hassan Adam Musa, a Fur man from Garsila. To understand Abdul Rahman's role in these killings, it is important to understand his involvement in the arrests and detention of these victims. On your screen now is a map of the Delej region. The towns of Delej, Garsila, and Zalangi are all seen on this map. Located in Garsila was a military intelligence office belonging to the Sudanese Armed Forces, which was used by Abdul Rahman and others during this period as a place of detention. each of the 5 men who I have just named were detained here just prior to the Delej events. 2 of them had been arrested on Abdurrahman's orders. Another had been arrested following Abdurrahman's allegation that he collaborated with the rebels. Also detained here was Janif, the coordinator of the Popular Defense Forces in Gastila. On or about Friday, 5 March 2004, Abdurrahman went to the military intelligence office in Gastila and tried to take custody of Umda Adam Kandiri, Umda Jido Kamis, and Janif. He was very upset to learn that these 3 men had in fact been released. Instead, he took custody of Umda Muhammad Suleiman Abdul Shafa, Sheikh Ismail Abdulaziz, and Hassan Adam Musa. Abdurrahman said he was taking the detainees to the military intelligence office in Zalangi. Instead, Abdurrahman took the detainees to Delej. In Delej, Abdurrahman ordered a search for Umda Adam Kandiri, Umda Jido Kamis, and Janif. Janjaweed and government forces arrested these 3 men in Delej on or about Friday, 5 March 2004. And as you heard earlier, Abdurrahman then killed Janif by striking him to the head with an axe. 2 days later, on or about Sunday, 7 March 2004, Abdurrahman was seen by multiple witnesses in Delej in a convoy of vehicles with the 5 detainees that I have named. There is no evidence that these detainees ever arrived at the military intelligence office in Zalangi. To the contrary, within days, news reached the people of Delej that this group of detainees had been killed and their bodies found in a location near Fede village, approximately here. The targeting of 4 community leaders in Delej fits the pattern of killings in Mukjar in the preceding weeks, where Abdurrahman was responsible for the murders of at least 3 umdas and 3 sheikhs from the 4 community. Mr. President, Your Honours, of course, Abdurrahman did not act alone. He committed the crimes in and around Delej together with members of the Janjaweed and government forces. Such persons included, in particular, Lieutenant Hamdi Sharaf Adin Sid Ahmed of military intelligence, who was also involved in the crimes committed in Mukjar, Musaddiq Hassan Mansour, also of military intelligence, and Abdurrahman Dawood Hamouda, also known as Hasabala, an officer of the Popular Defense Forces, who was involved in the crimes committed in Kudum, Bindizi, and surrounding areas. Each of these persons made contributions to the commission of crimes in and around Delej. As you have heard throughout this presentation, Abdurrahman's contribution was essential. Abdurrahman ordered and participated in the search and arrest operation. He questioned detainees and decided whether or not they would be released. Abdurrahman himself murdered at least 2 detainees and tortured, humiliated, and degraded others. Abdurrahman ordered and supervised the loading of detainees onto vehicles that transported them to execution sites around Delej. And Abdurrahman was present at one of these execution sites and directly ordered Janjaweed and government forces to shoot and kill a group of detainees. Through these actions, Abdurrahman not only directly committed crimes himself, but ordered, influenced, and assisted members of the Janjaweed and government forces to also commit crimes.
Madam Prosecutor, you're left with 1 minute.
Mr. President, Your Honours, the crimes committed by Abdurrahman in Delej had a great number of victims. Between 100 and 200, predominantly 4 males, were detained, tortured, and degraded. At least 100 were murdered. To date, the prosecution has established the identities of 34 of the more than 100 persons killed. Their names now appear on your screen. In addition, at least 12 other Fur males survived attempts to kill them. But of course, there were many more victims than these. Each of these men and boys had a family and came from a community. Through the arrests and killings in Delej, Abdulrahman sent a chilling warning to the whole Fur population. Even the leaders of their communities were not safe. One witness describes the moment when he heard that the males who had been taken from Delej had been killed. Quote, "I heard what sounded like many women crying in Delej. It sounded like the whole town was crying." End of quote. The suffering caused by these crimes remains until today. The impact was described by one witness. And Your Honour, with your permission, I would end my presentation with this quote from the witness. It may take me slightly over the 1 minute.
Conclude in 1 or 2 minutes, not more, please.
As Your Honour pleases. Quote, "I could not bear talking about what I had experienced in Wadi Salah. I avoided all discussions on what happened in Delej with anyone and would leave the room if the matter was raised. I have the memories of running for my life and seeing the old people from our villages crawling as they were attempting to flee. But from all the painful memories I have from my past, what happened in Delej is the most painful one. I escaped Delej, but so many stayed behind and died." As you've heard, there is ample and compelling evidence establishing substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Abdulrahman committed the crimes in Delej and surrounding areas, as alleged in the document containing the charges. Mr. President, Your Honours, I thank you for your attention, and I'll now give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Nichols.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nichols.
Thank you very much, Your Honors. Just to say we have concluded our presentations. We thank you, and we ask that all counts be set down for trial.
Thank you very much. Now we turn to the oral submissions of the legal representatives of the victims. Before doing this, I would kindly ask Madam Principal Counsel of PCV, would you please explain the Chamber how you have divided the time allocated to the legal representative of victims? You have, as you know, 2 hours for all of you. Please.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honours. Thank you. The presentation of a legal representative will start today with the presentation of Ms. Clooney, followed by the presentation of Mr. Amin, and I will conclude. The presentations of Ms. Clooney and Mr. Amin should take an hour, and my presentation should take between 47 and 48 minutes.
Thank you very much. Then this hour will take us to the next break, so I immediately give the floor to Madam Clooney, first legal representative of victims. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, Your Honours, good morning. It is a privilege to appear before you today on behalf of victims of crimes against humanity committed during the war in Darfur. Almost 20 years ago, the forces of Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir launched a campaign against the citizens of the Darfur region of Sudan that the UN estimates has killed 300,000 civilians and displaced over 2 million others. The Sudanese government conducted this campaign hand in hand with Janjaweed militiamen. And as you have heard from the prosecution, the Agid al-Ogada, commander of commanders, is a man in the room here today, Ali Abdulrahman, widely known as Ali Koushib. I wish that all the survivors could be with us in this courtroom today. Victims of these atrocities have waited 18 long years for this moment. 18 years to see a Janjaweed commander finally face justice for war crimes and crimes against humanity. As violent clashes continue today in this region of Sudan, with civilians attacked by the Janjaweed's successor, the Rapid Support Forces, we see the price that is paid for impunity. Cycles of violence continue. Victims' wounds cannot heal, and reconciliation is forestalled. Your Honours, this case is in many ways unusual. This court has put presidents on trial, and many cases involve questions about what a senior official, remote from a crime scene, mobilized others to do. That is not the case here. This suspect is accused of being a senior leader, but not one who simply approved battle plans from a distant capital. He is accused of using his whistle to give orders to Janjaweed fighters from his horse. He is accused of stomping on detainees' backs as they lay face down on the ground. He is accused of murdering civilians by hacking them to death with an axe. My clients include the direct victims of these crimes and eyewitnesses to them. They saw the suspect face to face. And indeed, many of the victims in this case knew the suspect before the conflict. One victim said just last week, quote, "I want my lawyer to tell the judges that before the conflict, Ali Koshib used to come to our house because my father was an umda, meaning chief. He used to send me to run errands." Other victims know the suspect from his pharmacy in Garcilla. And a young fur mother from Garcilla told me that she grew up calling him Uncle Ali. So this is personal, and a chance for a reckoning that many victims had long given up hoping for. Your Honours, my submissions today will proceed in three parts. First, an introduction about the victims I represent and why they have chosen to participate in this process. Second, I will describe their views and concerns about the charges that the prosecutor has presented for confirmation. And third, I will outline their views and concerns about the scope of these charges. Mr. President and Your Honours, it is a sobering responsibility to represent the interests of 126 survivors who have so much hope in what this court can do. The victims in this case are orphans and widows. They discovered the corpses of their brothers, fathers, childhood friends. They witnessed the rape of their wives and sisters. They are themselves victims of such crimes. They are refugees. But before that, they were farmers, drivers, cooks, traders, teachers, and students. Many of them lost everything they owned and their potential to live a happy and healthy life. Some still bear the scars of torture. Others lost the ability to ever have children. And Your Honours, of the 126 victims I represent, more than 3/4 still live in a camp for the displaced. That's almost 2 decades after the devastation that was unleashed in Darfur. Your Honours, life in the camps means fighting each day to get enough food, water, and medicine. It means knowing that any woman who leaves the camp to collect firewood is at risk of being attacked. It means knowing that without education or opportunity, there is no way out. and knowing that there is nowhere to go, because those who put you in the camp are still out there. One of the parents who is in a camp told me that, quote, "We are living a very humiliating and undignified life here. Yet many children have known no other home." Your Honours, the victims I represent are members of the Fur tribe. That is, of course, no accident. As the prosecution evidence shows, the Fur were systematically persecuted by Janjaweed forces, acting in concert with the Sudanese military. And the unimaginable pain they have suffered has been rendered more acute by the complete absence of accountability. Instead of seeing the perpetrators in handcuffs or in a dock, victims have had to watch them go back to a normal life, something the victims can never have. Indeed, Janjaweed leaders are today serving in government, and the one senior leader who was imprisoned in Sudan was held on unrelated charges and pardoned and released earlier this year. This is why the victims are all determined to pursue accountability for the crimes in Darfur, and why this case is the only chance they've got. This case is their first opportunity to see justice, and they don't just want to watch, they want to participate. One victim I represent told me at the end of an interview, "I have to go now, I'm going into labor." She delivered a baby girl later that day. But she said she found it so important to speak to her lawyers because, as she put it to me, for 17 years, nobody has asked me what happened to me. Women who are victims of sexual violence have said that they haven't even told their husbands what happened to them, but that they would be willing to speak about it before this court if invited to do so by the prosecutor. Your Honours, this determination is humbling, and it is widespread. As one victim, a male nurse who lives in an IDP camp in Sudan, has put it, "I am ready to testify, even if I have to walk to the court alone." In anticipation of this hearing, I asked my clients, "What does justice mean for you?" They all seek reparations for the harm they have suffered, but they affirmed that justice goes far beyond that. Many victims highlighted that justice means an acknowledgement of the truth. I quote, "Justice is recognition of what was done to us, of our suffering." Another victim, a man suffering from malnutrition at a camp, echoed this idea, saying, quote, "Ali Kousheb should be tried and held accountable for his crimes in order to elevate the pain suffered by his victims." For others, justice means security and the ability to go home. In the words of one victim, quote, "For me, justice means the safe return to our lands and villages and the ability to exercise our rights freely, as we did before the conflict." Many victims said that justice also means stopping the cycle of violence. A Fur teacher living in West Darfur said that a lack of justice would, quote, "embolden the suspect's associates who are still roaming around with their arms and committing crimes." Victims also highlighted that justice is for the next generation. As a Fur farmer who's almost 70 years old put it, "If I live until the judgment day of Ali Kousheb's trial, I would like to take a photo with my legal team so that I can leave it to my children as a memory." Finally, a number of victims said that justice empowers those who were powerless and helps to restore the rule of law. As one survivor from Amjamena put it, quote, "We were harmless. We didn't even have cane sticks. and yet they came with machine guns. This was also the conclusion of another survivor, a Fur man who still lives in a camp with his wife. He concluded that, quote, humans created laws to stop evil from prevailing. When those laws are rightfully applied, evil is stopped and human dignity is restored. This is what justice means to me. Your Honours, I would like to move now to the second part of my submissions, where I will convey the views and concerns of the victims about the charges that have been put before you for confirmation. It is my submission that, as the prosecutor has argued, there is ample evidence before you to confirm the charges and commit this case to trial. Under Article 61 of the Rome Statute, the Chamber must confirm the charges against a suspect if it determines that there is, quote, sufficient evidence to establish substantial grounds to believe that the person has committed the crime charged. And in the Btهم case, this chamber clarified that the standard is met when the prosecutor offers, quote, proof demonstrating a clear line of reasoning underpinning the allegations. Your Honours, the prosecution's theory of the case is clear. It is that Sudanese soldiers and Janjaweed militiamen committed crimes against humanity and war crimes in 2 municipalities of West Darfur, and that this was in furtherance of a state policy to attack the predominantly Fur civilian population in this area. Specifically, their case involves 3 key allegations. First, that there was an attack around Kudum in Bendizi in August 2003 that resulted in mass killings, rapes, pillage, and displacement. Second, that about 6 months later, Fur men were rounded up, detained, tortured, and executed in and around the Mukjar police station. And third, that shortly after that, the same thing happened in and around the Delej police station. Your Honours, my submission is that, as my learned colleagues from the Office of the Prosecutor summarised yesterday, the prosecution has presented sufficient evidence to meet the substantial grounds test for each of these charged incidents and each of the 31 counts underlying them. And as a result, this case should proceed to trial. Mr. President, I need not repeat what you have already read in the case file and heard from the prosecution. But on behalf of victims, I can, pursuant to Article 68 of the Rome Statute, convey their views on these charges. First, in relation to Kudum and Bendizi, the views of the victims are fully aligned with what the prosecutor submits. Victims who were present in these areas have described the impact of a large Janjaweed and Sudanese government force attacking these areas in land cruiser vehicles, on horses, camels, and on foot. One female survivor recounts how she started running for her life as she witnessed, as she put it, people, quote, falling on the ground like locusts. Another victim, who is a mother of 7, reports the anxiety, anger, and fear she still feels after witnessing these attacks, during which her family was killed in front of her and her entire village burnt to the ground. The prosecutor charges sexual violence as part of this incident as well. And this is supported by victims who have relayed harrowing accounts of rape and gang rape at these locations. The prosecution's description of pillage also mirrors the harm suffered by many victims who shared that their homes, livestock, and crops were burnt, and who seek, as one put it, to quote, rebuild what the war has destroyed by participating in this case. Finally, the prosecution alleges that the attacks in Kudum and Bindisi served, quote, to expel the predominantly Fur population of these places by forcing them to flee into surrounding mountains and forests. I have heard from victims who found themselves in this exact situation, forced to flee into the wilderness without food or shelter, as it was the only option, in the words of one victim, quote, to save ourselves. Your Honours, the second set of charges relates to the events in Mukjar. This incident is, of course, connected to the first, because, as the prosecution explained yesterday, victims fled the devastation in Kudum and Bindisi, seeking refuge in nearby towns. But instead of finding sanctuary, they walked straight into an execution site. The prosecution submits that Janjaweed and government forces arrested hundreds of predominantly Fur men and then transferred detainees to Mukjar police station, where they were mistreated and ultimately executed. Here too, the prosecution's charges align with what victims recount suffering in Mukjar at this time. For instance, the accounts of prosecution witnesses that the suspect struck an Umda named Yahya Zarouk to his skull and shoulder bone with an axe are consistent with the views of a number of victims who saw this gruesome attack. And many of my clients were, like prosecution witnesses, detained at Mukjar police station. One victim had his leg broken from a beating in detention, and a 50-year-old Fur farmer and father of 6 was beaten so badly that he was left with medical issues affecting his kidneys and pelvis to this day. Others report severed nerves as a result of stab wounds, and one of my clients had to have his shoulder amputated after being stabbed in his shoulder with a bayonet. So the victims fully support the inclusion of these charges. Finally, as your honours know, the third charged incident took place in Delej in March of 2004. The prosecution submits that Janjaweed and Sudanese government forces arrested between 100 and 200 Fur men in one day, and then tortured and murdered detainees at the police station and nearby locations. According to prosecution witnesses, at least 2 Fur men detained at the police station were beaten to death with an axe-like object by the suspect himself. Victims fully support the inclusion of these charges as well. My clients include victims who witnessed the deaths of detainees who are alleged to have been killed by the suspect. They include a family member of one of the Umdas who was allegedly killed during these incidents, and a family member of 3 victims identified by the prosecution as having been killed during these events. The prosecutor's allegation that detainees were forced to lie down outside the station in the hot sun while they were walked on and beaten, including by the suspect, also describes the experience of many of my clients. Victims describe being forced to lie face down with their open mouth in the dirt and being beaten with a bayonet or with a stick. And, like a number of prosecution witnesses, many victims recount the trauma of witnessing the suspect beating detainees and stomping on their backs with his boots. Such victims have spoken of the severe sorrow that resulted from witnessing these events, and also of rage, because, as one victim put it, the mass killing happened before my eyes, and I was helpless, unable to do anything. Finally, the victims have spoken of the harm they suffered as a result of the campaign of persecution described in the charges. The prosecution submits that the suspect and his men targeted and denigrated fair civilians. And this is unfortunately entirely in line with the harm described by victims I represent, who have recounted that they were called, quote, sons of dogs, slaves, Nubians, and Zerga, meaning blue, on account of their darker skin. Your Honours, this concludes the second part of my submissions, and before I close, I have a third issue to briefly address. This is to follow up on my written submissions filed in advance of this hearing, summarising the views and concerns of victims about the scope of the charges. Your Honours, as you have recognised in a previous case, the victim's right to present their views and concerns may include concerns as to the choices made by the prosecutor in the formulation of the charges. And as I explained in my written submissions, the victims are concerned that the charges, as presently formulated, are unduly narrow. Your Honours, I am well aware that once a trial has begun at this court, the factual basis of the charges cannot change. So my submissions at this stage focus on the need to expand the investigation before the start of trial to include additional crimes within the geographic scope of the case in Arawala, Mukjar, and Garcilla, but also critically to focus on crimes of sexual violence. The prosecutor has confirmed in her policy paper on sexual and gender-based violence that she will, quote, ensure that charges for such crimes are brought whenever there is sufficient evidence to support them. And she repeated this commitment yesterday. Yet, Your Honours, at the moment, 2 of the 3 incidents covered by the charges relate only to male victims. And the only charges of sexual violence relate to a 2-day period in 2003 when Janjaweed and government forces are alleged to have raped at least 17 women, including 1 rape victim who was relied on yesterday at the hearing by the prosecution. This tiny slice of accountability leaves so many women excluded. One of my clients, a father of 8 daughters, stated that this exclusion is, quote, very frustrating and shocking, since, quote, the Janjaweed used rape as a weapon, and female survivors are ready to testify before the court. In the words of another victim, who was only 15 when he saw his mother shot to death as he tried to prevent his sister being raped, quote, rape is a very serious crime because it destroys communities, and if rape is not charged, ongoing rape will never stop. In my written submissions, I outlined the fact that the current charges do not reflect the accounts of 3 victims I represent, who have stated that this suspect personally raped them within the time frame and at locations covered by the current charges. These victims, and others highlighted in the submissions, believe that their accounts must be fully investigated so that further charges can potentially be brought and so that their voices are not silenced. Victims have also spoken of their concern that the crime of genocide has not been charged, and the issue of legal characterization will be addressed in due course. Your Honours, Mr. President, there is nothing more cowardly than what Ali Koushayb and his men are accused of doing to innocent and defenseless civilians. Men shot in the back as they tried to run away. Young girls held down to be raped. Children ripped off their mothers' backs and slaughtered. And yet I've never seen courage like that of victims determined to tell their story and fight for justice, even though they risk violence from the same people in doing so. So I stand here today on behalf of courageous victims in this case, and on behalf of all the victims of the Bashir regime and its Janjaweed allies. And I ask you to allow this trial to go ahead. Because, Your Honours, if perpetrators can continue to get away with these crimes, they are destined to be repeated. This is why, when Justice Jackson opened the trial at Nuremberg, he said, "The wrongs we seek to condemn are so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." Victims of the war in Darfur who have had to watch the Janjaweed simply rebrand themselves, be pardoned, or even promoted, speak of the same imperative. I'd like to end with a quote from a victim because I can't put it any more eloquently than a young Fur man who was only 9 when he witnessed the Janjaweed slaughter his father and brothers. He said that, quote, "Justice means preventing what happened to us from happening to others by ensuring that criminals face the same consequences as Ali Koushayb if they commit crimes like this in the future." Mr. President, I hope that this hearing will mark a turning point in the history of Darfur, and that a trial in this case is only the beginning of the reckoning that the victims deserve. Your Honours, that concludes my opening submissions, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your submissions, Madam Legal Representative of Victims. Now, Mr. Amin, Sabah Khair, good morning. The floor is yours.
Counsel would need to turn on his microphone.
Mr. Amin, regretfully, we haven't heard anything because your microphone was off.
سيد القاضي الرئيس حضرات القضاة.
Mr. President, Your Honors, allow me in my capacity as the legal representative of victims to convey to you their views and concerns in this hearing. But before this, please allow me to thank the courts because it has allowed me to offer my submission in the Arabic language, which is the language that is spoken mainly by all of the victims. And this is a support, it's a mental support after all of the suffering that they have suffered over 18 years ago. Mr. President, Your Honors, I will speak about 3 key points. The first, a corroboration of the evidence presented in the prosecution's memo through the accounts of the victims who I represent. Secondly, a description of the harms that afflicted the victims as a result of the crimes perpetrated against them. Thirdly, presenting the views and concerns of the victims in front of the court. Mr. President, Your Honors, now I will speak firstly about the corroborating the evidence presented in the prosecution's memo through the victims' own accounts. And here I would like to confirm that all of these crimes that have been suffered by the victims are listed in the document CR 2021/04694, and I have chosen only a few to name. Only these are just a few of the number of the victims who I have met myself, and I have heard to them personally, and I represent them personally. And here I would like to say that these victims confirm what has been presented in the prosecution's memo. It also confirms what we have heard yesterday and today from the representative of the prosecution in all of the crimes and charges that are being charged against the Mr. Ali Koshib. And we have examples of one of the victims who have said, and here I quote, "Towards the end of 2003, my area was attacked by the Janjaweed led by Ali Koshib and Daif Samih." And here, please consult Annex A4 of this, the list of the evidence, which is confirmed in the prosecution's memo through the victims, what the victims have suffered. And here, Ali Koshib was accompanied by other people who were corroborating with him. And here I continue, and I quote that after the villages were burned, many of the people had to flee to Mogjar, and the Janjaweed were arresting many of these people who were fleeing out of Mogjar, and they were persecuted, and many of the people were actually were arrested, and especially Mayor Yahya Omar Razouk, and this is in Annex A10 of the list of evidence. This evidence, Mr. President and the honorable judges, supports what has been put in paragraph 5, which addresses the contextual elements under Articles 7 and 8. It also supports the paragraphs numbers 73, 74, 77, 79, 80, 84, 85, and 89 of the prosecution's memo. Another victim has said, and I quote, "Bindisi was attacked on August the 14th, 2003 by the Janjaweed, who were led by Ali Koshib and by one of their leaders called Daif Samih." Please consult Annex A4, end of quote. In this description, in the way of the attack and all of the crimes that were committed by the Janjaweed, he also said, and here I quote, "The Janjaweeds were heading towards Kudum, and during this attack, Sidir, Merli, and Derinkel were burned and looted. And then they came from there to Bindisi, and once they arrived, they burned and looted everyone's belongings